Approved 4 years after his death, Luther Burbank's spirit loomed large over the 1930 U.S. Patent Act. At the end of his career, Burbank had fought for the rights to patent his new plant creations. As he died before the act was instated, however, Burbank used other methods to ensure profits from his plant hybrids. An investigation of these methods lends one a view into how Burbank used multiple avenues of industrialization and marketing to gain a competitive edge, and then eventually how the application of industrialization then changed the relationship of business to the production of novel plants in a way that Burbank could not keep up with. Considering that Burbank's work informed debate surrounding the institution of the Plant Patenting Act of 1930, it would be tempting to trace a single line of influence where Burbank's innovations led to the patenting of plants. And although this is possible, I'm not convinced this is the most interesting or fruitful way to look at Burbank. Although Burbank saw himself as applying the ethos of industry to the development of plants, his own considerations of how plants grew and changed didn't easily fit with industrial attempts to define ownership. Specifically, Burbank treated plants as highly correlated forms, where many traits were tightly linked together. This led to a phenomenologically based means for documenting novel strains of plants that made his experiments difficult to describe, let alone patent. I focus on Burbank's conception of novelty in plant production for two reasons. First of all, as one of the well-known triad of tests for patent, the other two being utility and non-obviousness, novelty is considered a key condition in order to grant a patent. Second of all, up until very recently, many of the patents taken out in biological materials emphasize novelty at the expense, perhaps, of the other two tests. According to the geneticist Maynard Olson, this was because, quote, patent law never greatly concerned itself with utility. It is actually a much more highly refined tool for judging novelty, unquote. Olson suggests that the test for novelty was more important in patent cases because applicants only needed a generally plausible story of the object's utility. The actual test of utility of an object was often left up to the market to decide. Although some of his plant novelties were awarded patents posthumously, Burbank died before he could ever take advantage of this aspect of industrial creation. Quote, there is, however, one feature of plant development that puts it on a different plane as regards probable financial returns from that occupied by most other fields of inventive or creative industry. And this he writes in the 5th volume of the 12-volume set of Burbank and his methods. This is the fact that nothing comparable to a patent can be obtained in new varieties of fruit trees or flowers, such as the development of new mechanical inventions or chemical combinations or artistic productions can depend upon to guard his invention and make it at least probable that he will share in the profits that accrue from its introduction. In fact, Burbank calculated that for his fruit trees, he had as little as a 3 to 4 year competitive advantage before competing orchardists could bud, grow, and reproduce enough trees to sell to the public. Consequently, Burbank is most revealing for having employed manifold strategies for obtaining financial rewards without securing patents. Primary among Burbank's inventions involved developing a new economic niche as a commercial plant hybridizer, an occupation distinct from a farmer or a nursery keeper, experimenting on vast scale in order to bring multiple products to market at once, vigorous self-promotion, and extensive use of catalog marketing. All these efforts kept Burbank and his horticultural novelties in the public's eyes and provided new cultivars for sale to wholesalers and farmers. One of Burbank's insights was that if produce could be bred that would withstand the travel, he could use the power of the railroad to supply fresh produce to those at a distance. Quote, it was in my time too that consumers showed that they would pay high prices for fresh fruit, preferring it to canned goods or dried fruits. I saw that this would be true, but I was one of the first. In fact, for a time I was the only man devoting study and experiment to the end that fruits might be developed that would stand transportation and arrive in the hands of distant consumers in attractive conditions. It was here that I began my work with plums. In Burbank's self-conception, he could doubly benefit from the growing middle class's clamoring for fresh produce. He not only created the fruit and vegetable stocks that growers would purchase in order to deliver fresh produce, He produced the plants and trees that those seeking solace from the cares of the city would plant in their gardens. Consequently, Burbank was not a traditional nurseryman, nor was he a traditional farmer. He was a plant organizer. He created new forms of life that could then be sold to nurserymen, seedmen, and farmers alike. Burbank would sell one of his creations for a sum, then the nurseryman would propagate the plants for further sales. A single plant stock could fetch up to as much as $5,000. Burbank thrived in a new economic niche that allowed him to exploit the powers of industrial production, that while comfortably recalling the sensibility of less comfortable times. Another aspect of Burbank's work, informed by witnessing industry, was the skill that he worked upon. A special feature of Burbank's work, wrote Hugo de Vries in his book on plant breeding, is the large scale in which his selections are made. It is evident that in a variety of mixed conditions, or in the offspring of a hybrid, and even in ordinary fluctuating variability, the chance of finding some widely divergent individual increases with the number of plants. And this scale, as Burbank himself noted, was dictated in part by the need for a quick turnover in production. Nature, wrote Burbank, had all the time there was and all the raw materials she needed, and thus she could work at a more leisurely pace. She made millions of trials and millions of failures, but she wasn't under contract, and no one was writing her indignant letters beginning in the matter of the shipment of the pine trees ordered from you 500 years ago for our temperament climate, begged to advise the same has not yet arrived. Burbank understood that such experiments I would have to conduct must be performed not with one or half a dozen plants, but on a broad scale, literally by wholesale. In fact, the terms that Burbank used to describe his production methods gained power through the use of industrial imagery. In short, to borrow the language of industry, Burbank wrote, I not only had to speed up production, but I had to build up and maintain quantity production. And so one of the things I kind of want to point out here in these quotations that I'm using is the relationship of Burbank to nature. And so he kind of envisions himself not necessarily as a creator per se, but as speeding up nature, in a sense. And I'm going to tie that into the way he thinks about plant life in a second. Especially important was Burbank's exploitation of a growing market for catalogs. And the use of the popular press. Burbank's reputation depended on promoting his name. Consequently, he used a number of publication strategies to help control how his name and reputation were presented to the public, very much crafting how his name would come out and kind of influence the markets for his work. Published from 1893, and this is a copy of the first catalog, until before his death in 1926, each of his catalogs used copious amounts of photo reproductions, demonstrating how improved in appearance most of the creations were from a wild type of well-known cultivar. And here, towards the end, you start seeing him exploiting four-color print process in the catalogs themselves. Burbank's publishing efforts didn't stop at catalogs. In his autobiography, ghostwritten, produced a 12-volume set on his methods and their importance, and repeatedly published a number of shorter pamphlets that described his methods while advertising his creations. Burbank also spread his word through his use of the paper press, and his wife later on had a radio program, and he also gave some popular lectures. Some critics have even gone on as far to suggest that self-promotion and not hybridization is Burbank's true skill. This overlooks, however, how much Burbank relied on promotion as a business strategy. His window for a monopoly in a specific cultivar could be as little as a single season for his flowers and vines and 3 to 4 years for his fruit trees. Developing an immediate demand for a specific plant was crucial to Burbank's survival. Although Burbank constantly complained about the ill effects of his popularity, it's hard to imagine a similar level of success for Burbank without it. He was a celebrity, and the cream of California paid exorbitant prices for an hour in the grounds of his experimental farm. Here is his ticket that allows you to get to the experimental farm. In this case, costing $10. It's a little bit hard to figure out what that rough equivalents are, but using, for this purpose, consumer price index is probably fairly good, and it's about, it's, 250, 280 to 280 bucks for an hour. Considering that Burbank grasped how industrialization would change the production and distribution of plants, his overall understanding of the applicability of other large-scale business practices seems superficial at best. For instance, his record keeping was idiosyncratic and dependent upon his own highly valued sense of smell, sight, and taste. This made retracing how he identified his novelties difficult to explain and repeat. In a lengthy report to the Carnegie Foundation, which had funded Burbank for a while, scientific breeder George Scholl complained at length about Burbank's inability to maintain proper records. E. Carlton McDowell, in an unpublished history, summarized Scholl's Carnegie report by claiming that Burbank's, quote, so-called records proved utterly useless. The information was in Burbank's head. To get this recorded, he would have to dictate answers to Scholl's questioning. And then, although Scholl was most interested in the scientific ramifications of record keeping, it's also important to note that securing patent also requires extensive records. As Daniel Kevis as recently wrote about the role of IP, record keeping, and IP in general, the establishment of intellectual property in an invention also calls for the capability to reproduce the product with its valuable characters. Absent that, the IP would be worthless. Interestingly, Burbank's conception of life worked against establishing plants as intellectual property. Keeping proper records just never appealed to Burbank. He wasn't interested in the documentation of specific characters. Rather, he saw plants as highly integrated products of forces. Burbank made his money by noticing gross formal changes in the disposition of the plant in relation to the climate that nurtured it. He often appealed to Georges Cuvier's correlation of parts to explain how interlinked the traits of a plant were. And this is a quotation. Now it is at once obvious to anyone who studies plants attentively that their structure also shows a corresponding and no less invariable correlation of parts than animals. The more conspicuous illustrations of this are obvious to the most casual observer. The various adaptations of form of tree and shrub and vine to their natural surroundings are so patent that they cannot escape attention. This notion of patent, and this is actually very interesting because it's another way of thinking about that signification of patent, of a patent as patent by its labeling. And for Burbank, that takes a whole other level of interest because of its relationship to the notion of latent. Knowing how traits correlated with each other allowed Burbank to select his plants as seedlings before the expressions of the desired novel characteristics of the plant. So this is using the correlations in a highly selectionist model. He would then take seedlings, and although this doesn't actually, I don't think this says exactly what the seedlings are anywhere in the book itself. What he claims he does is only would remove a few of the seedlings from this one particular flat. In Burbank's eye, nature always created differences. Okay? So novelty is always within nature, and a successful hybridizer could gauge these differences at the youngest stage possible. Working at such a large scale not only promoted economic benefits by allowing Burbank to continuously bring multiple varieties to market, it produced a specific view of life. Hybrid crosses produced new creations, but only at a small frequency. In the wild, the environment would then select for these crosses, but in Burbank's garden, he and his assistant would find the important progressive golden cross that would prove important for marketing. Again, de Vries understood the importance of working at such a large scale. Quote, in some hundreds of specimens, a valuable sport can hardly be expected, but among thousands it may well occur. The result depends largely on these great numbers. More remarkable than Burbank's industrial scale crosses was his industrial scale elimination of the unfit. In 1 year, he burned up 65,000 2- and 3-year-old hybrid seedling berry bushes in one great bonfire and 14 others of similar size. This view of plant evolution emphasizes new forms as opposed to new traits. Burbank's plants were novel because he had created them to better fit the demands of a specific environment, an industrialized society. Perhaps the biggest difference between Burbank's use of the term novelty and our own is that current conceptions of novelty thoroughly rely on processes of standardization. For plant hybridizers, the creation of a strain or cultivar demonstrating a new trait is a novelty. These traits are often selected from strains highly purified by inbreeding In order to legally or scientifically justify the claim of novelty, now one must first document exactly what is novel and demonstrate that it has not yet been introduced into the public sphere. A task that is most convincingly executed if what one existed before was thoroughly uniform. This observation is important. Although many cultural historians have noted how industrialization helped standardize life in the 20th century, few of these historians have begun to suggest how standardization led to a redefinition of what constituted novel experience. It is increasingly clear that the use of record keeping, the development of pure strains, and the implementation of novel types of genetic crosses, such as the Mendelian bat cross, or chromosome mapping through the recombination of mutants, enabled the development of classical genetics. Each of these techniques contributed to a refined description of novelty as variance, occurring over the background of standardization, such as been recently explored in the work of Christoph, in his work on purity. Consequently, Burbank's view of the hybridizer stands at odds to those who the benefit of patents. As Elaine Pillage and Brad Sherman have recently argued in the history of the 1930 Plant Patenting Act, the role of the breeder and the law was to normalize the abnormal, to stabilize and standardize nature's deviance, mutations and aberrations, to save this freak or abnormality in plant life to make it useful to mankind. This stands in opposition to Burbank's more formal conception of novelty that saw potential differences in each plant where novelty was everywhere and where the role of the breeder was to speed up the ability of nature to produce variance and then to capitalize on this variance as quickly as possible. Burbank saw himself as working with plants to help them enter the next stage of evolution, the age of the railroad. Since he had no recourse to patenting, Burbank utilized a manifold of other industrial innovations to maximize his profits during the brief window of time he was a singular supplier of a novel creation. Perhaps this was for the best, as Burbank's conceptions of plants as constantly varying but highly correlated forms did not encourage him to adopt key practices needed to stake claims for intellectual property or even scientific authentication. This is one of the many ironies of Burbank's life. Although Burbank argued for the importance of patenting late in his career, he still had little insight into how the mutating concepts of novelty and ownership would change the business of manufacturing and selling horticultural novelties. Thank you.